Stood upon chapter 13. I stood upon the sand of the sea. This is the Apostle John. We know he's in heaven, and don't know where the sea is, but we assume that he's somewhere back down between heaven and earth, because he saw a beast rise up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his horns 10 crowns, and upon his heads the name of blasphemy. I've seen all kinds of pictures over the years, the last 50 some odd years, since I first sat in a church and had the pastor go through the book of Revelation from verse for verse. And they have these, artists have drawn these real graphic pictures of what they think this beast might look like. And it may look something like that. You know, that's the first thing that pops into our mind, is having 7 heads. Is it a body with 7 heads on it? But each of these images have a more realistic picture for us, as we'll see as we get into this in a little bit more detail. Now, I need you to be patient tonight, as well as pray and listen, because I think for an order from now from 13 to 22, in order for us to understand it and grasp the depth of it, we need to put a lot of background in here. We need to put a foundation in here. And in particular in chapter 13, I need to share with you, in my case, I'm going to share with you 50 years of history and how it now fits when we look back. Prophecy, if you will, or prophecy in pictures, if you will, of what 50 years ago when I first had Revelation taught to me have become more clear today in our time. And to understand this chapter, if you want to go ahead and turn over there, we're going to start with Daniel chapter 2. And in Daniel chapter 2, the king, who is the world king at the time, Nebuchadnezzar, King Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. The best way I know how to explain it is he didn't have a clue what the dream was about. In fact, if you have ever read about the whole context of Nebuchadnezzar, he ultimately winds up like a wild animal out in the field, but then gets saved towards the end of it. But we have to assume then when he has this dream, he's not yet saved, but yet God is using him. And how is God using him? God uses Nebuchadnezzar to bring Daniel into the picture so Daniel can interpret the dream. And if you have Daniel chapter 2, verse 31 is where we'll start. It says, "Thou, O king, sawest, and behold, a great image." He says, you saw in your dream. See, the king couldn't even tell his own magicians what he saw. It just bothered him. He knew it was, it says here, terrible, but he couldn't even explain it. So he had to depend upon divine intervention. He may not have understood divine intervention, but he wanted somebody that had divine intervention to tell him what he dreamed and what it meant. And so Daniel is responding to the request that has been given to him. He says, "And behold, a great image, the great image whose brightness was excellent, stood before thee, and the form thereof was terrible." Now, our understanding of terrible is something that is horrible. But in this case, it's mind-boggling. It's mind-boggling. Verse 32, "The image's head was of fine gold, his breast and his arms of silver, his belly and his thighs of brass, his legs of iron, his feet part of iron and part of clay. Thou sawest till that a stone was cut without hands, which smote the image upon his feet that were of iron and clay, and brake them to pieces. Then was the iron, the clay, the brass, the silver, and the gold broken to pieces together, and became like the chaff of the summer threshing floors, and the wind carried them away, that no place was found for them. And the stone that smote the image became a great mountain, and filled the whole earth." This is the dream. and we will tell you the interpretation thereof before the king. Thou, O king, art a king of kings, for the God of heaven hath given thee a kingdom, power, and strength, and glory. And wheresoever the children of the men dwell, the beasts of the field, the fowls of the heaven, hath he given into thine hand, and hath made thee ruler over them all. Thou art this head of gold, and after thee shall arise another kingdom inferior to thee, and another third kingdom of brass, which shall rule over the earth, all the earth. And the fourth kingdom shall be strong as iron. For as much as iron breaketh in pieces, and subdueth all things, and as iron that breaketh all these, shall it break into pieces and bruise. And whereas thou sawest the feet and toes, and part of potter's clay and part of iron, the kingdom shall be divided, and there shall be in it of the strength of the iron, for as much as thou sawest the iron mixed with miry clay. And as the toes of the feet were part of iron and part of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly broken. Verse 43, and whereas thou sawest iron mixed with miry clay, they shall mingle themselves with the seed of men, but they shall not cleave one to another, even as iron is not mixed with clay. And in the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom, which shall never be destroyed. This is talking about the millennial kingdom now. And the kingdom shall not be left to other people, but it shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. For as much as thou sawest the stone, that the stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it brake in pieces the iron, the brass, the clay, the silver, and the gold, the great God hath made known to the king what shall come to pass hereafter. And the dream is certain, and the interpretation thereof. Now the four-part statue here that's described in Daniel chapter 2 represents four great Gentile kingdoms. And these kingdoms, history has proven, did exist. One is the Babylon kingdom. Babylon existed. Babylon is today would have been somewhere in Iraq, and Medo-Persia, and which is Iran, and Greece, and Rome. And then two legs in verse 33 symbolize the Roman kingdom divided in two parts. Again, history confirms that towards the end of the fall of the Roman Empire, that the country the empire was divided in two parts, western and eastern. The 2 feet and 10 toes in verse 41 are a picture of the restored Roman Empire, which has not yet happened, but what will happen during the tribulation period. The four beasts in Daniel chapter 7 are the same as the four-part statue here in chapter 2. From Daniel, we learn that the Gentile world power, that it runs its course and finally gets to Rome, and because of idolatry, because of spirituality, the worship of idols, and not idols but the spirit world, and worldliness and self-centeredness, because of all of these issues. Now this is history. Because of all of these issues, Rome doesn't collapse, it just kind of fades away. Now we all know there's a Rome today, largest city in Italy. And I wouldn't suggest you walk down the sidewalks in Rome without watching very carefully, because cars drive down the sidewalk. And there is a place, I've used this as an illustration, that the tourists will take you out to a road that looks like a spider web that heads out, and they call it the Romans Road. It's not the Romans Road we describe in Scripture, but the Romans, when they went out and they conquered a city, from that city they would build a road back to Rome. And as they went around and conquering these cities, the road would come back. And if you look at it on a map, it's like a spider web of roads leading off into these different cities. The end times, this kingdom will be revived, as I mentioned, under 10 nations, represented by these 10 toes. Now let me take you back into not too distant history, but in 1992, the Wall Street Journal, I used to be an avid fan of the Wall Street Journal, used to be. I was an avid fan. I traveled a lot, spent a lot of time on airplanes, and they gave away Wall Street Journals. That was one of the reasons why I was an avid fan of it. And so I read a lot, and every time I'd see something, I'd rip it out and take it with me, and I've got it in my files, and I'll let Mark figure out if he wants to throw it away, burn it, whatever, one of these days when it all goes to him. But in 1992, the Wall Street Journal published an article on the European Common Market, or what was called the ECM at that time. And the ECM was going to vote on the foundation of a world currency. And the projected national gross product of this entity, if we can describe it that way, it wasn't as a nation. It was a conglomeration of nations, and they were going to basically form their own economic council. And this economic council would, of course, have their own currency, and I'll get back to that in a moment. But the projected national gross product of that was 3 times that of the United States. This was in 1992. It's probably 5 times that today, because it still exists. And it's interesting to note that when we look in Daniel chapter 34, or chapter 2, verse 34, we read that thou sawest till that a stone was cut out without hands. This is God that Daniel sees coming down and cutting out basically an entire mountain. What he's doing and what the description is, what the picture is creating the millennium period for us. And so Christ will then establish his kingdom. And, but where are we today? Well, history proves that Daniel's prophecies were accurate. Everything Daniel said would happen has happened, except for this consolidation or this. I have listened for 50 years to pastors say, well, it's going to be England, it's going to be the U.S., it's going to be this, it's going to be that. I've come to the conclusion after listening to this taught and reading about it for 50 years that we're not going to recognize this confederation of 10 nations, because I believe it's going to be a consolidation of like the United States and Canada together, for example, and I'll get into a little bit more detail on that in a moment. But the Antichrist is going to set this up. He's not just going to say, hey, you guys are now under my command. He's going to merge them together in his own nations, his own way, for his own purpose. History, we live in a society where it's a fringe group, but a very vocal group and a very forceful group that is trying to eliminate history. You heard me make the comment many times that here a few years ago, public schools stopped teaching cursive in schools. I don't know if they have changed that or not, but they stopped teaching it. And you go back and you study, and you Google it, you'll find out that the whole purpose, there's an underlying faction there, that all of our historical records are in cursive. So somewhere down the road, the students that are in school today are not going to be able to read the historical documents. That's one of the ways that they're trying to cover up history. What does all that mean is, Satan can't change what's already happened. He cannot change those that have come to know him. He cannot even change those that are going to come to know him. What he can do is confuse this world more so than what he is right now. And if you think Putin's not demon-possessed, then you need to go back to Scripture and read the description here, what God provides for us. You see, only the formation of these 10 toes of the restored Roman Empire is left to happen, other than the rapture. When the rapture occurs, we're out of here. If you want to hang around and see what happens on your own, I wouldn't recommend that. And I say that jokingly, because if you're saved, you don't have any choice. You know, it's been some time ago, I was in a church over in Flower Mound, and they had an evangelist there. I had never met him before, and he was preaching on Revelation, interestingly enough. And he stood there, and he slapped the pulpit, and everybody got up like that. He says, blink your eyes. You see everybody blinking their eyes, and he says, too late. And even the pastor was looking at him. Too late for what? If you depend upon your physical capability of of alerting you that the rapture is going to take place. It ain't going to happen. Twink of an eye happens quicker than you can blink your eyes. So God reminds me every day, be careful of what you're doing. Be careful of what you're doing. And be careful of where you're going. Be careful of what you're thinking. Be careful of what you're looking at. And I could go on and on and on. The rapture is going to potentially catch some Christians in, we might say, embarrassing situations. I don't know about you, and I've often said this. When the rapture occurs, you know where I'd like to be? Right here. Right here. Right here. So, it's my belief that this federation spoken of in Daniel dates back to what we call this European common market, or today it's known as the European Union. Some say, well, oh no, that's got to be NATO. NATO is still active. Well, so is the European Union still active. Isn't it interesting that NATO was established in 1949 as a conglomeration of the U.S., Canada, and several Western European nations to protect the world from Russia? What kind of job are they doing today? Not very good, in my opinion. But we go back to the European Economic Council. Who's got the money? NATO depends on paying members to support it. Much of the equipment that, now here's something that really just rubbed me the wrong way. Much of the equipment, probably 70 to 80% of the equipment that NATO has, they have an army. NATO has an army. It's a consolidated army of all these countries that are a member of NATO, and almost 80% of the equipment we provided, we, the United States, provided. Yet when it comes to the command of NATO, you know who outranks the command? United Kingdom does, France does, and several other Western European nations do. We send our soldiers over there, and it's their equipment, and they're the expert pilots. They're the ones that are going to fly, but yet our commanders aren't in charge. Some other commander is in charge. Why? Because of the world's superiority in the ranking of the military. There's a paper out there. There's actually a book. It's online. You can read it. You can even subscribe to it online. I don't know if they publish it anymore in print, but called the Jane's Military Journal. And every year they measure the military might of all the countries in the world. And for years and years, up until even after World War II, America was the strongest nation in the world. And we stayed that way until Vietnam. Then we began to fall a little bit. And then we went back up a little bit. And then going back about 20 years ago, and you can place the presidential people in place that were there, and not all of them, but most of them were Democrat. About 20 years ago, they decided we don't need to be spending all of this trillions of dollars on the military, so we're going to take this money and we're going to put it over here, and we're going to invest in electric cars and wind turbines and all of that sort of stuff. And as a result, you talk to the military, and I spent 3 months talking to the military virtually every single day in the island of Okinawa, and they would tell me, it says, it doesn't do us any good to have the most modern equipment in the world if we can't get spare parts. And spare parts cost money. And we don't have the money because the president is using it for this and that and so forth and so on. A few years ago, many people doubted that the European, or actually I should say a few decades ago, doubted that the European Common Market could possibly be this foundation because it only had 6 members. Then a couple of years later, about 1973, the United Kingdom and Ireland and Denmark joined, and others joined, and then in 1993 they began bringing in what they call the European Union. The European Union joined together with the European Common Market, and then they, because there's money involved, they legalized themselves into the European Union legally. This was about 2009, I believe it is. And they are now have 27 members. And this is why I'm not too concerned about, well, we got to have something that has 10 members of it. The Antichrist is going to form it into 10 members, not us. Years later, Spain and Turkey began to be in there, and the key is, and it's interesting here, you have 27 members and you got 10 that have paid faithfully over the years to support this. So there are the 10 members that pay for it. And just think about it for a moment. What does it take to get elected today in America? Charisma. First of all, has to be somebody that looks good. Somebody that the whole world knows. That the whole world knows. It doesn't matter whether, the thing that always got me is I was talking to a professor one time when I was teaching college classes, and he said, we don't need any businessmen in the powerful position in America. We need politicians. I said, oh no. I said, we are the strongest economic country in the world. We do need a businessman in there. Go back. Was Trump, did he look good? Not really. Did he talk good? Not really. Did he make friends? Not really. Was he charismatic? Oh no. But did he understand economics? You betcha he did. Did he understand how to run a country? Yes, he did. Did he understand how to stand up to our enemies and say, you guys are idiots, get out of here, we're running this show? Our current president won't do that. He might insult somebody. Well, go back to what wins a war? A war is when somebody attacks you. What is Joe, when somebody swings at you, what is your first reaction? And then what? Hit back, right? What is the Ukraine not doing? They're not hitting back. Why? Because NATO won't let them. Because NATO won't let them. NATO won't bring them on board, but NATO won't let them. It gets very, very complicated, but the end result is that if somebody, I guarantee you, if somebody were to attack America, and I've said this before, we wouldn't need a president commander-in-chief to make the decision. It's already in place in about a half a dozen places throughout the United States. We have nuclear weapons that under certain protocol, the president, he carries a little bag with him, and he opens it, and he puts the key in there, and they put the key in there, and the missiles go flying. And it doesn't, you don't have to vote on it. You and I won't get to vote on it. That's already been laid out, and it's been in place since World War II. You would be amazed if you had an opportunity to go up into the mountains up above Colorado Springs and see just see what's in there. I mean, I had the opportunity to go in there a number of times, and it is a self-contained city. They have their own underground water. They have their own electrical plant, all built underneath, and it's all nuclear. They have nuclear missiles in there. They could shut that down and exist for years. And all of that is in place. Now, where does that lead us to? There's three things that I'll say this, and then we'll stop, and I'll have to give you a little bit more history next week, and then we'll get into the verses. But there's three major decisions that have been made in the past 30, 40 years that have resulted in the circumstance that we're facing today. Number one is that some of our former presidents, as I've already mentioned this, they've reduced the capability of the military. They've reduced it. Some would even say that if somebody striked us first, we would have to go ask Nancy Pelosi for her permission to fight back. Now, that's not the case. If they strike first, all that's in place, that would take place. And even though we don't have the military equipment This Jane's Journal makes it, and I like this because they're very honest about it. They say, we don't have the capability militarily means equipment-wise, that we have had in years past, but the American men and women in the armed forces are the strongest in the world, because we're not a forceful, like Russia. They're forced into the military. Israel, men and women, when they reach 18, they go in the military. We used to have the draft, and now it's all volunteer. So the fact that we have an all volunteer military, we have still described the strongest people together, and you're seeing that a lot in the Ukraine. They've been paying attention over there. They are grossly outnumbered, but yet what Putin thought would last about a week or a couple of days at the most, it continues to go on, and people are coming in from the surrounding countries and joining the fight to keep Putin out of there. Second, we've had third-rate countries like Somalia. Most of you go back and remember what happened in Somalia and the Balkans, challenge our military superiority, and we didn't do anything about it. We didn't do anything about it. I can remember them dragging a soldier through the streets of Somalia, and yet there was an outrage throughout, and Clinton was president. There was an outrage throughout America why we didn't go over there and just bomb them. But you know what Clinton's advisors told him? Just be quiet about it, it'll go away. And you know the sad part about it is? Went away. And that same mentality exists today in our administration. Just be quiet about it, it'll go away. Well, maybe not. Maybe not. But let's stop there, and we'll get into verse 1 next time. Well, let me share the third one. I said there's 3 of them. Finally, for the first time in history, and I've already mentioned this too, the United States is under the command of other military forces. And that's all due to presidential decisions. Beginning with it started way back with President Kennedy, which is back in the 60s. And if you go back again and read did you know that up until Afghanistan, now even Vietnam, I know a lot of people will disagree, but when we left Vietnam, I'm not in agreement with the way we left Vietnam, but when we left Vietnam, the South and North had agreed on a peace treaty, and they'd each agreed that they would meld in sometime down the road as a single nation, which they did, and that we would start getting out. And I know this because we were on Okinawa, and it was like a junkyard, because they were bringing in tanks, and they were bringing in aircraft, they were bringing in helicopters. And they did this for several years. In the middle 70s, they were still bringing things in to basically back out of it. So we accomplished our mission. We went over there and we gained the South, what the South Vietnamese had lost, we gained it back to them. Now, did they turn around and give it back up? Yeah, they did. But when we left, we had left it with South Vietnam. The only conflict that right now the Jane's Journal describes as us losing is Afghanistan. The only time in American history that we have lost a war is Afghanistan. Why? Because the war was still going on when our president decided, we're done, that's enough, we're gone, and then he leaves $5 to $8 billion in equipment. Giving you all of that is a background, because that's where we're going to see headed into the description of this war that's going to take place during the book of Revelation. We're set up now with one vote of the Supreme Court. We could merge into, the United States could dissolve tomorrow with one vote. The United States could dissolve tomorrow. If the rapture were to occur right now, within the next few moments, everything's in place for a one world government. The Antichrist doesn't have to say, well, we got to do this, we got to do that. You see, there already is a world currency. Is anybody investing in Bitcoin? It's a world currency. It's a world currency. We've already got a world army, NATO. And I could go on and on. Everything's there. Everything's there. We need to be in prayer every day for our nation, because we don't know when the horn's going to blow. And if we're going to have to hang around for a while, I don't know about you, but I don't want to see $5 worth of gas, $5 gasoline, and I don't want to see our economy crumbling, and I don't want to see some of the things that we're seeing in the way we are. There's countries that depend upon us, and if we're not going to support them, then we're going to continue to lose face in the sight of the world leaders. Let's pray. Father, thank you for